So I'll just go very quickly over problems which seem to be serious with the Darwinian theory. And the first of these, perhaps the biggest of these, is what was presented by Karl Popper in the 1960s, I think, or 70s. And well, he was a philosopher of science, and he pointed to the tautology in Darwinian theory, because the theory was really survival of those which are fittest and those which can reproduce most, no? But then you ask, what are the criterion of fitness? And there would be so many, because it depends on the environment, and each species is actuando in a different environment. And you never know all of the parameters in that environment or how they are affecting the individual. So the best way to answer the question is, which of those individuals are the fittest? You would have to say that those that survive are the fittest. But then Darwinian theory is just saying that this is survival of the survivors, which is a tautology. It's not saying anything. And Popper later recanted on the tautology criticism, because it was demonstrated to him and to others that, of course, we can apply a very specific environment to an individual or a population and select only those populations which can survive in that environment. For example, giving bacteria a particular food source, and only those which can metabolize that food and turn it into energy will be able to survive. And so those experiments were done, and this was kind of like a demonstration that Darwin's theory was not really tautology. You just have to be able to define very specifically the environment, and then it made some kind of sense. But anyway, he recanted on the tautology aspect, saying that no, okay, it's not a tautology, but it's still a metaphysical research program, because you have to be very specific in order to make sense out of it. And we know that in the real world, all the individuals in different species are very coupled in many different hierarchical ways, and also not only with themselves, with the living material, but also with the abiotic environment. So it becomes a metaphysical research program to say those that are most fit are the ones that survive, and that's how evolution occurs. So there's another problem, which is that life appears to be different from abiotic objects by having this inherent will to survive and thrive. So what we see is the vitality of life. For instance, why don't all animals just give up and just die and don't run away from the predator? What is the chemical or physical basis behind that, that will to survive? And if we get to our level, the human level, where we have a brain, we could say, oh, well, some of us want to survive because we have children. We want to take care of our children. We want to see their future. So that makes sense at that level. But if you go all the way down then to the bacterial and then to the cell level, then it becomes very hard to understand why indeed is there such a will to survive and thrive among the living material, but not the non-living material. And that is related to this other question, that what is the level at which natural selection is operating? And Darwin thought it was at the individual level, but Richard Dawkins, the guy I pictured here in the photo, he suggested it was really at the gene level, and that the individual was just a survival machine for the gene, that the individual, the physical individual, the macroscopic individual, was providing protection for the gene. And what really was occurring was that the genes were fighting for survival, and those best genes would survive and those worst genes would fall out of the population. But also Darwin realized that there was also appeared to be selection at the family level. That is, that a good parent, for instance, will sacrifice their life to save their children. So that's altruistic behavior. Or you could also sacrifice your life to help others in your tribe. And so he realized that, well, maybe selection was not at the individual level, but at a higher family level. But then we can also say the same for the species, at the species level. And then go all the way up to the ecosystem level, and then finally the biosphere. The only problem is that as you go higher up in the hierarchy, then the number of individuals becomes less and less. So there's less species than there are families, and less individuals than there are families. And so on. And when you get to the biosphere, you only have one biosphere. And this biosphere is not in competition with another biosphere. And we're not selecting the one which is most survivable, obviously, because there's only one. So this was pointed out by Rod Swenson also in the 70s. The problem at the biosphere level, selection at the biosphere level, is an evolution of a population of one, which is not occurring, of course, through the Darwinian theory. And we know that the biosphere is evolving because it is changing with time. And it seems to be, from our thermodynamic point of view, increasing in its dissipative effectiveness. So it's absorbing more photons and dissipating more photons. And if you start from that hypothesis that the real selection is at the biosphere and the real selection is thermodynamic and dissipation, then you can really go back down to the different levels and explain in better detail what in fact is the Darwinian theory. What is it really talking about? That work is not completely finished, of course, and so that's for you guys to do. For example, put Darwin's theory on a more chemical physical basis. That's still available, no, for anybody there who's really interested in these themes. There was another problem, problem 4, which is problem of inefficient biological processes not being eliminated by natural selection. For example, this transpiration, we have large quantities of water which are transpired by plants and by cyanobacteria floating on the ocean surface. And this large transpiration doesn't seem to have any useful effect for the individual or for the species, for that matter. In fact, it's using up a lot of free energy.
Oh, yo tengo una pregunta con eso.
Yes, sure.
Ay, no me acuerdo, pero habían dos biólogos en algún momento dijeron que habían cosas que no eran resultados directos de la evolución, sino que era una característica que se tenía porque se tenían otros rasgos que sí eran evolutivos. Por ejemplo, la barbilla. Se supone que es porque tenemos, o sea, no podemos tener como la frente como la tenemos y la mandíbula como la tenemos sin que acabe en una barbilla. Pero la barbilla no tiene ningún tipo de cualidad adaptativa biológica darwiniana. Y le llamaban spandrel o las enjuntas de, como de las iglesias de los arquitos. Ajá, sí. Entonces, ¿no podría ser algo así? Que no están eliminadas porque es como lo que tiene que pasar para que pasen otras cosas que sí son por selección natural.
Sí, sí, ya no, tampoco recuerdo cómo se llamaban estas características que se saben que no tienen utilidad. Y a veces, no todos argumentan así, a veces argumentan de que no conocemos la utilidad, pero no significa que no hay utilidad. Por ejemplo, estabas hablando de la barba, ¿no? De pelo en la cara, si me entendí bien, ¿no? Y
no, la barbilla, pero ok, también la barba.
¿La barbilla? ¿Qué es la barbilla? A ver.
La barbilla es donde crece la barba.
Sí,
como...
sí, eso sí, estaba diciendo la
sí.
barba, ¿no? Sí, la barba.
Sí,
bueno, hay gente que dicen que este pelo sí era importante. Y si sales, por ejemplo, un hombre o una mujer, un hombre que está más peludo, aguanta mucho más los mosquitos cuando sale en la noche, ¿no? Porque los mosquitos tienen más problemas para picarse al llegar a la sangre por los pelos. Bueno, yo sé esta porque mis hijas siempre están quejando los mosquitos y yo estoy diciendo, ¿qué mosquitos? Que no, a mí no me están picando y más probablemente por los pelos. Y como la idea era que antes las mujeres se quedaban con los niños porque estaban embarazados unos tras otros y los hombres estaban afuera en el campo buscando la comida, ¿no? Según la historia, según las historias que hacemos, no conocemos todo seguridad. Entonces sí pudiera tener una utilidad el pelo. Y por ejemplo, los animales que están afuera todo el tiempo, que no utilizan ropa, se mantienen el pelo, ¿no? Entonces sí tienen una función. Pero también puede ser que nada más por chance, por una mutación, se ocurre una cosa. Y esta cosa se puede pasar por muchas generaciones. Pero si esta cosa requiere, por ejemplo, mucha energía libre, entonces esta debería de desaparecer en generaciones. Porque es una manera, si no sirve para nada, entonces por la sobrevivencia, entonces con tiempo debería de desaparecer de la población. Entonces, por ejemplo, la transpiración es muy intensamente dependiente de la energía libre que llega a la planta. Entonces no es cualquier cosa frívolo, ¿no? O por ejemplo, la segunda que es B, la exudación de pigmentos que se llama microsporin en el ambiente. Para producir estos pigmentos no es nada fácil, ¿no? Necesitas ocuparse con tiempo y energía libre para hacerlo. Entonces aquí creo que no cabe esta idea que mencionaste de que si hay características que no sirven para nada, pero nada más aparecen y se pasan a generación tras generación. ¿Ok? ¿De acuerdo?
Sí.
Okay. So going back to English, so that was problem 4, and problem 5 is paradox of the first tier. So Darwin imagined that all of the species would be evolving, or some would be disappearing and some would be evolving or transforming into new species. And at each transformation would be selected on the basis of whether that species was better adapted to its environment. So more and more as we evolve, we would become more and more adapted to the environment. But there are some forms, for example, the prokaryote bacteria, which have not changed in thousands of millions of years. Basically, they have remained the same. They haven't been evolving. And they have never surrendered their vast kingdom on Earth. And he says they are the most, by far the most abundant and most persistent of all life ever to have arisen on Earth. They still dominate life on Earth, forming two of the three major bowels of present-day life, the phyletic tree and the archaea bacteria and the yeast. So these organisms are hard to fit into the Darwinian program because they're not evolving, they're not somehow getting better adapted or improving their fitness with generation. They're staying basically the same. And problem number 6 is there's no function defined for life, no cause or no purpose. That is the Darwinian idea. So then we have to assume that it was just a spurious accident. But we know that this can't be true because all irreversible processes do in fact have a function. And that function, also viewed from the thermodynamic point of view, is to dissipate a generalized thermodynamic potential. For example, a hurricane, it's not a spurious accident. It actually arises under the thermodynamic principles to increase the dissipation of the temperature gradient of the system.
Doc,
¿Sí?
decir que sí,
Okay.
que la vida no tiene ninguna función o algún propósito,
Ajá.
¿tiene que ver con que somos sistemas altamente ineficientes en cuestión de energía? O sea que necesitamos consumir demasiada energía para seguir pues existiendo, digamos. Es por eso como que violamos como las leyes naturales que debería seguir la termodinámica, o bueno, que sigue la termodinámica.
Bueno, lo que estoy diciendo es que esta idea que vienen los biólogos, que la vida no tiene función o sentido de ser o causa, no es correcto para los físicos, o los físicos que creen en esta idea de la disipación. Esa es realmente una idea de los biólogos, porque no lo ven, simplemente no lo ven una posible función o purpose o causa. Entonces, por eso dicen esto, pero nosotros creemos que si hay una función que es disipación, igual que todos los procesos irreversibles. No sé si entendí bien tu pregunta, Ricardo, o quieres intentar decírmelo en otras palabras.
Déjeme pensarlo un poquito y se lo vuelvo a replantear, ¿sí?
Ok,
Gracias.
dale. Ok, y problema 7, parte de la teoría de Darwin is natural selection, no? So we have populations which are reproducing and there's a little bit of mutation, and then there is natural selection, which are selecting those individuals which are better adapted to their environment so they can survive longer and reproduce more, and therefore pass their genes to more children and more grandchildren, etc. But you can ask the question, what is selecting what? For example, Darwin thought it was the environment that is selecting the individual. But we know that individuals can in fact change their environment to their own advantage. And this is an example I gave of a beaver in a beaver dam. So it's making a new environment for itself in order to be able to survive longer. So in this case, the individual is selecting or changing, fixing the environment. And humans also have changed their environment when they're living in houses and they're not living in the bush anymore. So that's individuals selecting their environment. Or another very simple example is a bug, no? Bicho, that lives its entire life under a leaf. So it's selected the environment where it wants to live. So then we run into the problem or the question of what is natural selection actually selecting? Is it the environment selecting the individual, or the individual selecting the environment, or both of them? What's really going on? And part of an attempt to answer that question was the theory of Gaia by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. It was invented by Lovelock, but Margulis supplied most of the experimental and the data which went into supporting the theory, and now many people believe in the theory of Gaia. So let me just try to mention it to you. I think this is where we stopped last day. I tried to describe this theory and then get you to give me your opinions. No? So they say that living organisms interact strongly with and alter their environment in such a way to stabilize conditions for their own existence. So that was like in the case of the beaver here, no? So it wasn't exactly Darwinian theory that the environment was acting over the individual. It was that the two of them interact strongly together, the living with the non-living, in such a manner so as to stabilize the conditions for their own existence. And when they're talking about their own existence, they're talking about the existence of the animal or the living organism. So again, it's basically based on Darwinian theory. You know, it is the organism which is important, and the selection is such that the system increases its utility or being well enough to help the individual survive, you know, being of a certain form which improves the the survivability of the individual. So some examples are, for example, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, which is now 21%, but it could go higher. But the trouble is when it gets a little bit higher, maybe 23 to 25%, then all of a sudden we can have spontaneous combustion. We don't need a spark. Just as long as the material is dry enough, we will get spontaneous combustion in an atmosphere of a little bit higher concentration of oxygen. And that, of course, will destroy all of the ecosystems and we'll have fires all of the time around the world. So how do they do this? Well, according to Margulis and Lovelock, they do this because bacteria erode minerals in the rocks. By living on the surface of the rocks, they can erode the minerals and expose metals, for example, iron, to oxygen. And that provides oxidation, which takes out oxygen from the atmosphere. So by the erosion of minerals, the bacteria are, according to them, keeping the amount of oxygen at 21% below the value of spontaneous combustion. They're also doing that with the amount of salt in the oceans. So bacteria, for example, are growing mats, or they're like covers on salt, which is collecting in pools along the shore of the oceans. So the water comes in and gets trapped in the pool. Could be a tidal pool, which is provided by some rocks or some corals. And the water evaporates and leaves the salt. And then the bacteria form a mat, form a protective covering on the salt, so that when the rain comes, it doesn't get washed back into the ocean. And that's why salt collects at these tidal pools. And all the salt that we eat in our meals comes from ancient tidal pools. And it's thanks to these bacterial mats which prevented them from dissolving again through rainwater, for example, and going back into the ocean. So in that way, they're keeping the amount of salts in the oceans fixed, more or less at a constant value. The bacteria also controlling the temperature of Earth, and they do that by adjusting the greenhouse gases and also by, for example, producing clouds. I'm sure you don't know this, or maybe some of you have heard this, but some of the cyanobacteria which are floating on the ocean surface can produce a chemical substance which is called dimethyl sulfide, if I'm correct, if I'm not mistaken, which goes into the atmosphere and acts as a nucleus, the condensation of water vapor. So it's producing clouds. And apparently when the ocean surface gets too hot, these bacteria produce more of this substance to allow more nucleation, to provide more clouds, and therefore reflect some of the sun. And that is the way they're controlling the temperature, and also by adjusting the greenhouse gases, like reducing the amount of carbon dioxide, for example, when the system is too hot, and increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when the system is too cold for them. So this is like the weak form of the theory of Gaia, which says that animals or organisms change their environment in such a way to stabilize the conditions for their own existence. But there's also a rather stronger form of Gaia, which is that the whole biosphere is one giant regulating organism. So the whole biosphere is just like a cell, like I have written here on the right-hand side. The cell is made up of many different parts which are all acting together. And it was Margulis who showed that the different parts of the cell came from different, once independent organisms. And that they have come together in order to provide an environment more stable to the whole system. And for that, she won a number of prizes. And it's an interesting theory. I think symbiosis was actually postulated by in the late 1800s, but it was only recently with the theory of Gaia and in collaboration with Lovelock that they came to realize that part of the symbiosis theory could be extended not only to bacteria, but also to the whole biosphere. And so this is the theory of Gaia. So what do you think of the theory of Gaia? Does it make sense? It's again based on the idea of increasing the probability of survival of the organisms by changing the environment in such a way to make them more stable conditions for them. I don't believe in the theory of Gaia, I will tell you that, but it is interesting and there's a lot of data which supports it. But you can also look at the theory of Gaia from another point of view, that what is actually happening is that, yes, these organisms are interacting with their abiotic environment, but not to stabilize the environment for themselves, because they can always evolve and change. But what they're doing is causing the system of themselves with the abiotic part of the biosphere to be a better dissipator of the incident photons which are coming in. Okay. So, for example, if we can have also a snowball Earth in which the Earth freezes over. That's happened apparently, maybe 4 or 5 times in the history of life on Earth, that almost all of the Earth has become a snowball. And it's been reflecting a lot of light. But as long as we get a sufficient amount of carbon dioxide or other gases like methane, which are greenhouse gases, then we can go back to the green Earth, a green Earth. And so the point is that everything seems to be occurring in the sense that we are going to an Earth in which it is ever more covered with plants and cyanobacteria. And you could look at that like Gaia would look at that, saying that it's doing that for the survivability of the plants and the bacteria. Or you could take our thermodynamic viewpoint and say it's doing that because the plants and cyanobacteria are dissipating. They're very effective dissipators. And that's why they are adjusting the atmospheric gases, for instance, so that they can survive. But has anybody heard of the theory of Gaia before?
No, yo no la había escuchado.
Nunca.
Okay, it's good to have a look at the books of Lovelock and Margulis about the theory of Gaia. He wasn't able to publish. At first, they didn't like his work, so it was impossible to publish in articles. So he decided to create his own editorial house for publishing his own books. And he has some very nice books. They're very interesting, a lot of interesting data in there. They're going to cut us off very shortly. So let me just go on, see if I finish. It's only 2 slides. And then in the next hour, we'll go over the talk I gave recently in this Congress for ecologists and allow you to ask questions. So the Gaia theory, then both biotic and abiotic components of the biosphere are co-evolving together, but towards what? No, Gaia says towards being better adapted to both the organism, to life. Darwin theory also says nothing about the origin of life. So we're never going to be able to understand anything about the origin of life based on Darwinian theory. People have tried that by going down to the molecular level, the chemical level, and talked about competition between different chemical species or the stability of molecules. We'll see, though, that also doesn't really tell us much about the origin of life. It would be very difficult, and we have no solid theory based on that. So the situation, however, changes if we consider out of equilibrium conditions. So, for example, we have this ultraviolet light coming into Earth, being absorbed on life, and then being dissipated into the infrared. So you can show in this case that this system will evolve